Hello, Hardy 4th grade. Miss Prince here with our science video for the week. This week we are talking about ecosystems and how removing an animal from an ecosystem changes the makeup of that ecosystem. Now remember, an ecosystem is an environment, an area where multiple creatures, multiple animals and plants are living and coexisting together and depend upon each other for a certain circle of life. A predator may eat another creature in order to keep that ecosystem in balance. So we're going to learn about removing an animal from that ecosystem and seeing how that changes it. All right, today we are reading Yellowstone Wolves, Destroying a Predator. Remember, a predator eats other animals. In 1995, scientists made an unprecedented, that means it had not been done before, an unprecedented move that made many nervous. They introduced the gray wolf back to Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone's 18 million acres sits within the states of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, and is one of the largest ecosystems in the world. So how did the gray wolf, an apex predator, vanish from the vast wilderness of Yellowstone? To answer that, we must take a look back to the early 1900s. That's over 100 years ago, when the mighty gray wolf was seen as destructive and dangerous. The wolves hunted more desirable animals such as deer and elk, as well as domestic animals and livestock. Their presence in the western United States, and especially Yellowstone, was not wanted. By the year 1926, the last wolf pack in Yellowstone National Park was killed. Following the destruction of Yellowstone wolves, elk and deer populations increased. Other large predators such as grizzly and black bears, as well as coyotes, remained and preyed on the elk. But the wolves' absence from the ecosystem changed it dramatically. Before you continue reading about the wolves of Yellowstone, answer the following questions. So we have some more reading to do, but before that we're going to stop. We're going to pause just like we do in chunking and make sure that we have comprehended this part of the text first. Why were all the wolves killed in Yellowstone National Park? Let's look back up here. The wolves hunted more desirable animals such as deer and elk, as well as domestic animals and livestock. Domestic animals means pets, animals that lived around the area, cats, dogs. Livestock means goats, cattle, sheep, farming animals that may have lived in the area. Their presence in the western United States, and especially Yellowstone, was not wanted. By the year 1926, the last wolf pack in Yellowstone National Park was killed. So why were all the wolves killed in Yellowstone National Park? They were not wanted because of the amount of animals they were consuming, that they were eating. They were eating domestic animals and livestock, as well as the deer and the elk that lived in the park. How do you think this changed the ecosystem? Once all the wolves were killed, how would that have changed the ecosystem? Think about it. Take some time. If you remove a predator from the ecosystem, here's the wolves eating all the other animals. What's going to happen when that predator is gone? all these other animals are going to increase. Even though there were other large predators such as grizzly bears, black bears, coyotes, those were not as powerful as the gray wolves who had been removed from this ecosystem. So all of the other animals that the wolves were eating are going to increase in population. There's going to be more of them in Yellowstone National Park. What do you think would have happened to the ecosystem if the wolves were not brought back in? Think about it. What do you think's going to happen? Remember, deer and elk eat green shrubbery. They don't eat other animals. Sheep and goats and cows and horses, livestock do the same thing. So maybe Yellowstone may run out of greenery, shrubbery, plants for these animals to eat if there isn't a predator to control the population of animals that eat the greenery, that eat the grass and shrubs. Maybe Yellowstone would be overrun with goats and sheep and domestic animals if there was not a wolf population to control that livestock population. Maybe it would not be a desirable place to visit anymore. It wouldn't look as pretty with much less plant life, without enough grass and shrubbery to make it a beautiful park. Those are all good hypotheses. Yellowstone wolves. Ecosystem changes. Remember, this is what we're talking about, how the ecosystem changes when you remove an animal from it. The reintroduction of Yellowstone wolves began as an idea in the 1960s when biologists went to Congress to explain their concerns about the park's condition. Something's happening to the park without the wolves. High elk populations were causing ecological, that means in the plant life, ecological damage to the land due to very large herds. That means very large groups of elk. The absence of wolves changed many things in Yellowstone's ecosystem. Even though the elk were still hunted by bears, coyotes, and cougars, a huge amount of pressure was taken off the herds as their main predator, the gray wolves, was removed. Major changes took place after the wolves' disappearance. First, the elk population grew so large it strained the carrying capacity of Yellowstone. This means that there were more elk in the park than what the ecosystem could provide for. The second change was that the elk herds didn't move around as much as they did when they were not always running from the wolves. They stayed in the same areas of the park and fed heavily on young willow, aspen, and cottonwood plants. This proved to be a huge problem for not only birds who lost the trees that they lived in, but also for beavers who eat young willow trees. Their only source of food and shelter to survive the harsh Yellowstone winters. The lack of food was disastrous for beavers, and their population declined to almost zero. More changes took place after the decline of the beaver populations in Yellowstone. Beavers built dams and streams and small rivers, slowing down the flow of the water and creating many habitats for fish, amphibians, duck, geese, otters, and many other creatures. After the beavers vanished, they disappeared, they were dying off from Yellowstone, streams became larger and faster with nothing to slow them down. There were no more beaver dams. Many animals lost their habitats, their homes. The faster river also caused much more soil erosion. Remember, erosion is when bits of rock and soil are moved, soil being swept away by the river's force. This caused more flooding during the rainy seasons, as well as drying up of rivers during times of drought. Because the beavers' pools were no longer present, there was sometimes very little water for animals in the park to drink. 30 years after the disappearance of the wolves from Yellowstone, it became very clear to scientists that their absence had caused a cascade of damaging changes to the ecosystem. So they decided it was time to bring the wolves back to Yellowstone, and with the government's help, that's what they did. All right. Now we're ready to answer the following questions about the ecosystem changes that occurred with the removal of the Yellowstone wolves from Yellowstone National Park. The removal of wolves from Yellowstone caused many ecological changes with plants, animals, as well as the land itself. Using the text as your guide, complete the graphic organizer below by filling in each of the bubbles with changes made by the wolves' disappearance. You may draw more bubbles if you need them. If you have your packet from school this week, I want you to pull out this page and answer it on your own. If you do not have a packet, if you weren't able to go and pick one up this week, I want you to draw this on a blank piece of paper. It can be notebook paper, construction paper, the back of the paper bag, anything you have at home. Get a pencil or pen or marker and draw this. Right, removal of wolves in the middle, circle it, and then draw several arrows going out to other circles. After you've done that, I want you to look back in this text. What changes occurred because of the removal of the wolves? If you need to rewind the video to when I read this to you, you can do that. And as I'm reading, fill in the bubbles with changes that occurred. Right here is an example. Even though elk were still hunted by bears, coyotes, and cougars, a huge amount of pressure was taken off the herds as their main predator was removed. Major changes took place. Major changes is a key word. Took place after the wolves' disappearance. First, the elk population grew so large it strained the carrying capacity of Yellowstone. There were too many elk. The elk population was too large. That is one result of the removal of wolves. I want you to keep looking throughout this paragraph. Then here again it says more changes, another key word. Look for more changes and fill in this chart in your packet or on the piece of paper that you have created yourself. Do you think there were more changes that occurred in the park other than what you read in the text after the wolves were removed? So I want you to think, do you think anything else happened in the park that maybe this author forgot to mention because all the wolves had been killed off? Think about what else may have occurred, what removing a wolf from an ecosystem that depended on them may have done to that ecosystem. And now, before you read the final section, make a prediction on how Yellowstone's ecosystem changed once the wolves are brought back. So I want you to pause the video right here and either fill in your packet what your prediction is, how bringing the wolves back will change the ecosystem again, or write it underneath this graphic organizer that you have drawn yourself and created. Write a full sentence with a capital letter and punctuation. I predict. Fill in your prediction and put a period at the end. All right, now that you have done that, it's time for us to read Yellowstone Wolves Reintroduction. Fast forward to 1995. The first wolves stepped cautiously out of their pens and into their new home, the vast wilderness of Yellowstone Park. What the wolves did not know was that they were making history as they were reintroduced to an ecosystem that was not doing very well without them. American and Canadian biologists worked together to capture wild wolves in Canada to ship to Yellowstone. Altogether, 14 wolves from 2 different packs were brought to Yellowstone and held in chain-linked pens to get used to their new environment. The first pack of 8 wolves were released from their pen on January 12th. The second pack of 6 wolves were released a week later on January 19th. A year later, 11 more wolves were captured in the wild and released, followed by another 6 wolves 2 days later. Finally, in the summer of 1996, 10 wolf pups from a pack in Montana were brought in and released into the park. What happened over the next 30 years has amazed scientists. That's up until today. It's 30 years later. And boosted the value of wolves in all ecosystems. First, Yellowstone's elk herds began moving again. Because of the pressure wolves put on the herds as predators, the herds kept moving instead of staying in one spot. This gave the willow, aspen, and cottonwood plants time to grow again without being eaten by large herds. Many scientists believe this had a direct effect on beavers coming back to the area. As beavers work to dam the rivers again, that means building their large wooden dams that stop the flow of the water, which created ponds, multiple habitats came back for smaller animals. Another change that occurred after the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone was the availability of carcasses available to scavengers and other predators. Food became scarce after the wolves were removed from the area. Scavengers relied on elk, deer, and bison that died from old age or disease. Since the wolves came back, hunted prey became more plentiful. After the wolves fed on their prey, the carcass remains were left. This provided nutrition to many animals, including eagles, coyotes, and bears, who are quite hungry after winter hibernation. Biologists usually study the effects of what happens after a species is removed from an ecosystem by migration or extinction. But the case of the Yellowstone wolves gave the unique opportunity to observe what happens to an ecosystem when a species comes back. Now I want you to answer these questions on your own. Look back up in the text. If you need to rewind to where I read it to you, that is totally fine. How many wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone altogether from 1995 to 1996? So go back up and add together how many wolves. Explain the role wolves had in helping scavengers find food. Remember, scavengers eat the dead carcasses that have been left. Was your prediction correct about the ecosystem changes after the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone? Explain. Did you make a correct prediction? How does it line up with what we just read? Wolves and beavers are both known as keystone species. This means that their presence in an ecosystem is very important for many other animals as well as the health of the ecosystem itself. As we have seen in Yellowstone, if 1 or 2 keystone species are taken out of an ecosystem, many changes take place. Can you think of another keystone species in Yellowstone? Look back up and see if there was any other plant or animal that you think is very important to this ecosystem. Then explain why you think that. In recent years, the wolf population within Yellowstone has decreased due to disease. This means hunting by humans or wolves killing other wolves. This means that it's getting lower again. The total is around 80 wolves in the park, down from as many as 174 in 2003. Perhaps this is the correct balance of wolves to keep Yellowstone healthy. Explain why too many wolves could be a problem for Yellowstone. So we've talked about how removing the wolves completely hurt Yellowstone. Now, how could having too many of them in Yellowstone be a bad thing? Why could that be a problem? After you've answered these questions, if you still need help with anything, please comment below or reach out to your teacher. I miss you all so much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at end of year checkout on May 18th, friends. Love you all. Bye.